A steel needle bites into a 9-year-old arm. A single droplet of crimson blood blooms on the surface, yet the boy does not blink. He stares ahead, unmoved by the sharp intrusion. His tutor stands in the doorway, his skin turning ash gray as the silence stretches. The boy feels nothing. This numbness is the signature of a living death. Leprosy has claimed the heir to the throne. By age 13, Baldwin IV is crowned King of Jerusalem. He sits upon the throne, a monarch whose body is already a prisoner to the slow decay of his own flesh. The kingdom he inherits is a fragile red cross held against an ocean of shifting, hostile sands. Beyond the borders, a storm gathers in the east. Saladin, the legendary sultan, has united his empire under one singular, burning mandate to erase every trace of the Crusader presence from the map. The boy king looks out over his realm as his strength begins to fail, while the sultan sharpens his blade to reclaim the city. Inside the stone walls of Jerusalem, the air grew thick with treachery. Greedy lords gathered in candlelit corners, their voices low, betting on how soon the boy king would rot into his grave. They saw a dying child, not a ruler. They misjudged the fire behind his deadened eyes. In 1177, the threat became absolute. Saladin marched 26,000 men toward the city, a tide of steel and dust meant to crush the kingdom once and for all. Baldwin, now 16, refused to yield to the encroaching shadow. He moved in silence, his hands swaddled in layers of linen to hide the missing digits, his grip on his reins holding with iron resolve. He stood before his council and commanded the impossible. With only 500 knights at his back, he turned his horse toward the desert. It was a death sentence, a march into the maw of a giant. As he left the gates, he left behind the cowards who prayed for his end. He rode into the heat, the dust rising to meet his small, desperate force. The odds were insurmountable. The Sultan awaited him on the horizon, unaware that the boy he intended to erase was already closing the distance. The desert wind howled against the small band of knights. Baldwin reached the front of his line, but his legs betrayed him. He slid from his saddle, his frame buckling under his own weight as he hit the abrasive sand. He crawled. He dragged his failing body forward until he reached the wood of the true cross. He pressed his forehead into the grit and held the position, motionless, while the Sultan's thousands watched from the ridge. Then he stood. He wiped the dust from his face, his eyes fixed on the horizon, and drew his broadsword. His voice cut through the silence, a command that turned the air electric. The 500 charged. They hit the Sultan's lines like a thunderbolt, moving with a speed that defied the reality of their numbers. Horses collided, steel rang against steel, and the Sultan's formation broke. Panic rippled through the thousands. Saladin, stunned by the sudden. By sunset, the field was a landscape of broken steel and silence. Baldwin sat atop his horse, watching the dust settle. He had bought his kingdom one more day of life. Years passed, and the rot accelerated. By his 20s, the disease claimed his sight and robbed him of the strength to walk. He sat in his throne room, a silent figure in a darkening world. Emboldened by his frailty, the lords of the court ignored his warnings and provoked the Sultan, igniting a new war. Saladin returned with a vengeance, surrounding the fortress of Kerak. The walls trembled under the assault. Baldwin, blind and unable to stand, ordered his men to carry him out. 4 knights lifted his stretcher, and the procession moved toward the gates. He was a king stripped of his physical power, yet his resolve remained absolute. As they reached the edge of the battlefield, the Crusaders saw their leader and surged forward, their courage rekindled by the sight of him. High on a ridge, Saladin watched the procession through the shimmering heat. He looked down at the litter and saw a king who refused to yield to the grave. The Sultan lowered his hand, signaling a halt. He turned his army away, leaving the fortress untouched. A blind, motionless man had won without drawing a single blade. The desert wind blew across the abandoned siege lines, leaving behind only the silence of the Sultan's retreat. The candle burned low. In the spring of 1185, at 24, the king breathed his last. The crown slipped from his head, hitting the cold floor with a dull ring. and rolled into the shadows. The protection he had provided vanished with his final breath. Without his shadow to shield the walls, the kingdom crumbled from within. 2 years later, the gates of Jerusalem groaned open as the Sultan marched his forces through the city streets. The Holy Land was finally in his grasp. The banners changed, the guards shifted, and the city bowed to a new master. Yet, in the quiet of his chambers, the Sultan found no triumph. He stood alone upon the city walls, staring into the distant horizon. And deep within his heart, he knew this was not victory. History buried the king in the sand, but the memory of that unbreakable spirit remained. It was a weight no sultan could displace. The throne room sat empty, the dust settled on the floor, and the legend of the king who refused to yield survived long after the last of his empire turned to ash.